Again, thank you everybody for joining us for today's Qatar Transportation webcast. My name is Stephanie Lewis. We have a presentation today titled Airport Clean Vehicle Policies and Practices, presented by Alex Kolpakov and Austin Marie Cipiora. And let me take a few moments to introduce both of them before I hand the remainder of the time over to them. First, I'll introduce Alex. Alex is a research associate here at Qatar. He has over 15 years of experience in transportation research, and during his time at Qatar, he has managed a wide variety of transportation-related research projects, including evaluating alternative propulsion technologies and fuels, performing economic impact analysis of transportation investments, assessing aviation capital investments and airport security needs, and analyzing user rate and fees at public use airports, as well as performing transportation policy analysis. He holds a Master's of Arts degree in economics from the University of South Florida and a Bachelor's of Science in Management from Shavas State University. And Austin Marie Cipiora is a faculty researcher assistant here at Qatar. She has 2 years of experience in transportation research with expertise in alternative fuels and advanced vehicle technologies. And during her time here at Qatar, she has assisted with a variety of clean transportation and alternative fuel projects, including the development of education guidelines for electronic vehicle operations and assessment of clean vehicle policies and programs. And she co-manages the Department of Energy-sponsored Tampa Bay Clean Cities Coalitions and works closely with the community stakeholders to facilitate petroleum reduction projects in the region. Prior to joining Qatar, she conducted research in the fields of environmental policy, outreach, and education, and she holds a Master's of Arts degree in global sustainability from the University of South Florida. And with that being said, I am going to hand the presentation over to Alex. Is that right?
Hello, Stephanie.
Hi, Alex. Take it away.
All right. Thank you. The current presentation will discuss the results of the Airport Cooperative Research Project Synthesis, Clean Vehicles, Fuels, and Practices for Airport Private Ground Transportation Providers. The goal of this study was to research and summarize the experience of public use airports with implementing airport clean vehicle policies that are geared towards the private ground transportation providers. Also to look at the state of the practice, identify the major approaches, challenges, and best practices. This project was just recently completed in February of this year, and the final report will be published in a few months. What I've been told is probably around June of this year. But until it's published, everything that you'll see today is preliminary and unofficial. The way we're going to do the presentation is that Austin will talk about the airport part of this study, and I will talk later about the private fleets part of this study. So with that, I'll turn it over to Austin. Austin?
Thanks, Alex. So as he mentioned, this report was essentially a synthesis study that was looking at the experiences of airports and the private ground transportation fleets with incorporating alternative fuels, fuel efficiency, and other clean vehicle operations. So we conducted a brief literature review of prior research on alternative fuels application in the airport sector. We were really looking to get an overview of the current state of airport sustainability practices. So we found while there was quite a bit of information available on airport alternative fuel use, a few studies really focused on the applied use of those fuels with the private fleets. And I should mention before I get started that ACRP published a report in 2017 that reviewed alternative fuels use specifically for airport fleets. So that may be of interest to some of those on the line, and that report is available on the ACRP website. So for this synthesis, we developed 2 sets of questionnaires. One was for airports and one was for the private ground fleets, since we really were looking to capture the different perspectives on clean vehicle programs and initiatives. So the airport survey, which had about 32 questions, was looking to capture information on alternative fuels and clean vehicle policies that were employed by these airports, as well as questions that would really try to get a better understanding of the relationships and interactions between the airports and those fleets that serve the airports. So these questions were mainly centered on alternative fuel policies, availability of incentives, development history, implementation obstacles, and other experiences. So the questionnaire for private fleet operators had about 23 questions that were directed at understanding their sustainability practices, compliance with airport clean vehicle requirements if the airports did impose those, how involved the airport was with assisting those private fleets with adopting alternative fuels, and their opinions on how effective the airport clean vehicle programs were. So our research team conducted 30-minute phone interviews of both airports and the fleets. So initially we had identified 14 airports and 26 private fleets. We approached them with requests for interviews, and we received responses from 11 airports and 13 fleets, which put us at about 80% for airports and 50% response rates for the fleets. So these airports were selected based on several factors, including geographic location. We wanted to make sure that we had even geographic coverage, covering all of the FAA regions of the country. We considered airports of different sizes. We considered kind of various and different experiences with alternative fuels. And to a lesser degree, we also considered attainment status. There was an assumption that there may be more pressure for airports to implement clean vehicle policies in non-attainment areas. And of course, we also need to consider the availability of good contacts that would be willing and able to provide us the information that we were looking for. So, as was the case with our airport selection, our team wanted to identify those ground transportation operators who had prior experience with alternative fuels and technologies, and we also prioritized those fleets that served the airports that we had included in our interview selections, because we were looking to get both perspectives on the same issue. So I'll note that that was not always the case, and some of our fleets did operate at different airports. So as far as the types of operators go, we did choose from a variety of fleet types, so our responses would include diverse perspectives. So that included taxi cabs, limousines, and black car service, shared van rides, hotel parking shuttles, rental car shuttles, scheduled airport service, and the transportation network companies or the rideshare companies. So I'd like to emphasize again, I know Alex may have mentioned it, that the results in this airport are based on data from 24 observations, 11 airports, and 13 fleets. So that sample size is pretty low for the results to have any statistical significance. So really, these results should be treated as case studies or narratives and certainly not as representative samples. So one of our goals from this survey was really to get a better idea of the sustainability practices, specifically those practices that related to vehicles that were in place at the surveyed airports. So all of our surveyed airports reported either using or encouraging one or more practices intended to reduce emissions. So we noted that popular strategies included either the use or encouragement of use of alternative fuel vehicles, the use or encouragement of fuel-efficient and low-emission vehicles, idle reduction, strategies to reduce empty rides, also known as deadheading. And I should note that some airports did not require an explicit anti-idling policies, but instead employed strategies that could lead to reduced vehicle idling, whether it be by offering free parking, air-conditioned rest areas, anti-staging rules, or strategies along those lines. So the requirement to implement alternative fuel vehicles was definitely one of the most popular strategies. However, even the airports that actively use alternative fuels in their own fleets did not necessarily require their private ground transportation fleets to use AFEs. So almost all of our airports encouraged these fleets to use AFEs, but we found that such encouragement was often informal without mandates or incentives attached to that. So one of the things we considered were the types of alternative fuels that were in use by the airports. So we found that the surveyed airports seemed to favor natural gas and electric vehicles over other types of alternative fuel technologies, citing primarily the environmental or emissions benefits. We noted that 10 out of our 11 airports surveyed preferred CNG, 6 out of our 11 showed preference for electric vehicles, and 5 showed preference for propane. We also found examples of other fuels use, including liquefied natural gas, renewable diesel, and plug-in electric hybrids, although to a lesser degree. And I should note that, of course, that some of these fuels, including renewable diesel and renewable natural gas, are not necessarily available in all the markets nationwide, which could explain why they were not as heavily promoted. So most surveyed airports reported using multiple alternative fuel technologies for their fleet vehicles, and all of these reported having either fueling stations on airport property or in close proximity that the fleets could use. We found that CNG fueling stations and electric vehicle charging stations were the most common alternative fuel infrastructure found around the airport. And I should note that we also found kind of diverse ownership models for the fueling infrastructure. Some stations were directly owned and operated by the airports, while others were owned by the municipality where the airport was located, and some were owned and managed by private fuel suppliers. So as I mentioned earlier, our survey questions were looking to identify if airports were mandating or encouraging these private ground transportation fleets to use alternative fuels. We found that some airports have clear preferences for certain technologies, and they encourage those fleets to use those specific technologies. In other cases, the airports endorsed any or all types of alternative fuels as long as the fleet could demonstrate the environmental or emissions benefits. So the response from the airports showed that they most often encourage the private providers to use CNG, electric, and propane. 2 out of our airports also indicated while they did not require a specific alternative fuel, they did encourage their fleets to operate vehicles that were comparable to alternative fuel vehicles in terms of MPG and emissions. And I would also like to point out that not all of our ground transportation providers were subject to the same clean vehicle policies, as the contracts would vary between provider types. So 6 out of our 11 surveyed airports, that represents about half, reported having a formal clean vehicle policy that applied to the private ground transportation providers. And 5 airports reported they did not have an established policy. And we also found that 2 of our airports, while they did not explicitly impose any kind of requirements, they sort of had loose, informal policies in place to encourage those clean vehicle practices. And we found some variety with these clean vehicle policy structures. We have a couple of examples up here on the slide. Some of our airports require operators to use certain types of alternative fuels. In one of the major Southeast hubs that we interviewed, they do require their taxis and shared vans to use certain alternative fuel types. In others, we found that an airport would require transportation providers to operate alternative fuel vehicles or vehicles that meet certain minimum tailpipe emission standards. Some would require their fleets to use vehicles with certain minimum fuel efficiencies. One of the major hubs in the Northwest that we interviewed has established a minimum 41 MPG requirement, regardless of what fuel is used. So in some cases, the clean vehicle programs incentivize alternative fuel use as opposed to mandating. One of our airports employed an incentive program that offered lower airport fees to providers, kind of using the carrot approach. And in other cases, we found examples of the stick approach, where the airport imposes higher fees for fleets that were running conventional vehicles. So in addition to these policies, some of our surveyed airports impose requirements and recommendations to reduce empty rides. And we found that that mostly applied to the transportation network companies. And as I mentioned, we also found that different types of policies may apply to different types of providers. Airports may choose to regulate different providers based on their type of operation, the types of vehicles used, whether the airport is a primary market for that operator. So there were quite a few variables that came into play on how these airports regulated these fleets. And while this is not on the slide, I'd also like to point out that we did find a number of different incentive types that the airports provided to those fleets. That included offering lower airport fees, free charging for electric vehicles, passenger pickup priorities, and premium parking. And again, we did find that some airports had different regulations depending on the type of operator. We noted that taxis are not always, but typically regulated by local jurisdictions and not the airports. But out of those surveyed airports that did regulate taxis, they typically employ one of the following policies. They either mandated the use of alternative fuels, they provided a fuel efficiency standard, or provided incentives by offering those lower airport fees. And I would like to note that none of the surveyed airports applied any kind of clean vehicle requirements to limo fleets. In our discussions with several of the black car service providers, we did find that limo services use vehicles that are not really easily converted to alternative fuels, and there's also a limited number of alternative fuel models that can really satisfy the requirements of limo operations at a reasonable price. So our providers express that limo customers, really primarily value luxury and size more than environmental profile of the vehicle. And they also express that customer demand is what really drove their vehicle choices. So it made this kind of a challenging sector for the airports to regulate in terms of vehicle type or fuel. So our shared ride vans were found to be regulated more often than the other types of providers, which makes sense because sometimes the airport is their primary area that they operate in. So one of our surveyed airports that chose to impose these clean vehicle policies on shared van rides, most of them were more likely to employ an explicit alternative fuel requirement. But again, other policies could include minimum emission standards and then also the availability of incentives. So for our hotel and parking shuttles, rental shuttles, or scheduled airport service providers typically had one of 3 policies in place. Again, that included minimum emission standards, lower airport fees, or to impose higher fees for not using alternative fuels. And we did find that the transportation network companies, which Alex is going to talk a little bit more later on, they're an interesting sector. We found that, again, some are partially regulated by city, county, or state, and some, but not all airports have established pickup drop-off agreements in place with TNCs, but again, not all do. So airports that chose to impose clean vehicle policies on TNCs, we found that they typically employ one of the 3 types of policies, either the lower airport fees, again, the impose higher fees for not using alternative fuels, or the requirement for TNCs to implement and document vehicle mile traveled reduction efforts, which was kind of unique to the TNC sector. But overall, I'd say that the airports that we interviewed were generally less likely to impose any restrictions on the types of vehicles that TNCs could operate on airport property. In those cases where airports are regulating operators, we found that they are likely to focus on those fleets that could achieve the most significant result in terms of emissions reductions. So airports where TNCs account for a majority of the ground transportation trips are more likely to manage TNCs than airports where the TNC rideshare is smaller. So again, our goal was not just to identify what the airports were doing in terms of clean vehicle programs, but we also wanted to kind of find out the motivating reasons behind starting these policies and practices. And we found the most popular reason for implementing clean vehicle policies, whether it be a formal or informal standard, was primarily to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. 7 out of our 8 airports identified this as our major reason, followed by the desire to establish or maintain a green image in the community. Some airports implemented clean vehicle policies to comply with government regulations or as a result of legal agreements or decisions. We also found that some airports considered alternative fuels a business opportunity. We had several airports that owned and operated a fueling station, and again, part of the reasoning behind installing those was as a potential business opportunity. And lastly, several of our airports were participating in carbon accreditation programs, but I would note that the ground transportation emissions are considered level 3 and are not necessarily priority target emissions, as they can be kind of difficult to account for and regulate. So our airport cited various barriers to the adoption of clean vehicle policies. So when we asked, about half of our responding airports mentioned a lack of financial resources and grants for AFV acquisition as one of the major challenges. In addition, cost of alternative fuel vehicles and then the state of alternative fuel vehicle technologies were also listed as major barriers. And during our interview sessions, the airports also mentioned other challenges such as lack of understanding and prioritization of emission reduction from private fleets, the lack of availability of public fueling infrastructure, difficulty with monitoring and enforcing the policy, issues with the concession negotiation timelines, and also the impacts of TNCs on the ground transportation operators that would really limit their ability to impose those regulations fairly. And about the same time, about a quarter of our respondents could not identify any specific barriers preventing a clean vehicle program. So lastly, I'd like to just mention a couple of issues with funding for fleet conversions to AFVs. So as it is the case with any new program or policy, funding was, of course, a major consideration for our airports. So government grants and rebates, specifically ones that help deal with the incremental cost of the acquisition or conversion of AFVs, are really essential for those fleets to adopt alternative fuel technologies. And we see that across the board, not just in this specific sector. So we really did want to gain a little insight on the awareness of our airports on the availability of financial grants to help our fleets convert or purchase alternative fuel vehicles. So 6 out of our surveyed 11 airports were cited that they were aware of the existing government grants, while 5 airports reported not being aware of any grants. So the most commonly cited grants that can help airports with fleet conversions include the Airport Improvement Program, the VAIL program, the Diesel Emission Reduction Program, and the state grants that are funded by state-imposed fees or taxes. We saw that primarily in the California markets. And we also noted that some were familiar with potential funding opportunities from the Environmental Mitigation Fund from the VW settlement. But I do want to note that there are currently no established grant programs for airport clean vehicle conversions from the VW settlement, and these funds are being handled sort of on a state-by-state basis. So I appreciate your attention, and I'm going to go ahead and turn the presentation over to Alex, who will be going a little more in depth on the private fleet perspective.
Thank you, Austin. Well, Austin just talked about the potential incentives and funding options for the airports. Well, if the airports feel that they don't have a lot of funding sources to them, then private operators have access to an even smaller pool of potential grant funding opportunities. For example, 7 of the 11 surveyed airports indicated that there were currently no grants available to private fleets to convert to alternative fuels. And additionally, 2 airports also stated that they were unaware of any grants that are applicable to the private fleets. The grants that were identified included potential VW settlement funds, then some state grants, and a state voucher program that can lower the cost of alternative fuel vehicle acquisition. But the last 2 were mainly available in California. The airports also mentioned that in the past there used to be much more state grants and rebates for alternative fuel vehicle conversions, but some of the programs have been discontinued in the past. 8 of the 11 surveyed airports also stated that they are unable to help the private operators to receive government grants, and only 1 airport reported that it does help private operators with securing funding for fleet conversions to clean vehicles. All the airports that we surveyed allow TNCs to operate at the airport with varying level of regulations and oversight. 3 of the airports, which is half of the airports that have clean vehicle policies, do not require TNCs to comply with the airport clean vehicle policies. The 2 airports provide incentives for TNCs in the form of reduced fees whenever they use alternative fuel vehicles or implement the strategies to reduce empty rides. And 1 airport also applies a penalty-based policy where they penalize the TNCs for not complying with the fuel efficiency requirements. The contacted airports voiced several concerns and challenges related to the TNC operations, and the main challenges that we heard were that the regulations are still under development for the TNCs, and that allows those companies to enjoy their advantageous position. In some cases, the airports were unable to apply the policies to their transportation network companies because these companies were lightly regulated at the state level. And the airports also voiced a concern that they had difficulties in tracking the TNC operations because these companies usually employ a large number of vehicles and they have large driver turnover, so they did not provide their vehicle list or the driver information, so making it challenging to track their operations. So the airports have to rely on the data provided by the TNCs and work with them to establish geofence staging area for the airport trips. However, despite the above challenges, airports typically recognize that they have the responsibility to manage ground access that allow many ground transportation services and business models at the airport, and that includes the TNCs as well. Now let's talk a little bit about the perspective of the private operators. Overall, 13 airport private ground transportation providers were interviewed for this study. And as Austin mentioned earlier, we looked at different types of the operations, taxi cabs, limousines, shared van rides, parking shuttles, rental car shuttles, scheduled airport service, and TNCs. And the fleets that were chosen also had different vehicle ownership models. And why that is important is because vehicle ownership model affects the ability and willingness of the operators to implement clean vehicle policies. Fleets that own or lease their vehicles have usually more control of the types of the vehicles that that they operate than the fleets that mostly use owner operators. Well, in our sample, 7 of the surveyed 13 fleets, or more than half, own their vehicles, own the vehicles that they operate. And 3 surveyed fleets use owner-operator models when the vehicles are owned by individual drivers. And additionally, another 3 surveyed fleets also use the hybrid ownership model, which provides for partial ownership. So whenever part of the fleet is owned by the individual drivers and another part is owned by the company. The data from the surveyed fleets indicate that the larger fleets typically prefer owner-operators or hybrid ownership models, while smaller fleets are more likely to use company-owned vehicles. The fleets that we surveyed were also very diverse in terms of size. The size of the fleets ranged anywhere from 10 vehicles to over 400 vehicles. And again, why the size is important is because converting larger fleets with more vehicles is typically more expensive and may require more time. So the size of the vehicle, the size of the vehicle fleet also comes into the equation when the companies decide to convert their fleets to alternative fuels. Not all the surveyed operators run alternative fuel vehicles or clean vehicle technologies at their airport operations. But the ones that did run alternative fuels typically preferred CNG, hybrid electric, and electric vehicles. Regardless of the type of the propulsion, though, any ground transportation mode that uses high vehicle occupancy, whether it's shared van rides, parking shuttles, or transit buses, is usually environmentally superior to using private autos to get a ride to or from the airport. And the airports usually recognize that, and that is typically reflected in the policies and the policies that are directed towards such operators. All surveyed fleets use some sort of sustainability practices while they operate at the airport. The use of alternative fuel vehicles or idle reduction policies were the 2 most popular strategies for the surveyed fleets. The other practices also included the use of newer and fuel-efficient models and also deadhead trip reduction strategies. The most popular deadhead trip reduction strategies include matching drop-offs with the pickups at the airport and adjusting the type and the size of the vehicles for specific tasks to reduce empty seats. The operators can typically be penalized with higher trip fees if they do not follow deadhead trip reduction strategies that are required by the agreement with the airport. In fact, some operators complained that they found it really challenging to pick up a paying customer on the way to the airport, especially in the case of a short trip, and that was a requirement for their deadhead trip reduction policy that was imposed on them by the airport. Fleets may have different reasons for implementing clean vehicle policies. The top 3 reasons included reduce emissions and environmental impact, reduce operating costs, and comply with airport policy requirements. When asked about the future sustainability plans, the vast majority of fleets, basically 7 out of 10 fleets, reported plans to continue or expand the use of their current alternative fuel technologies. 3 surveyed fleets said they may consider other alternative fuel technologies in the future if their technical characteristics, costs, and return on investment parameters improve. And 2 survey fleets also reported no plans to implement additional sustainability practices. Private operators often feel that the airports do not involve them in developing clean vehicle policies. Again, this is the perception of the fleets. This may not necessarily be the case objectively, but there certainly is a perception that they are left out and that the airports develop these policies and just simply impose on the operators without consulting with them. There were some issues with the driver acceptance of clean vehicle policies that were communicated to us by some of the fleets. 3 of the surveyed fleets that are subject to the airport clean vehicle program stated that while they did encounter resistance from their employees at the early stages of policy implementation, uh, most company employees embraced the policies after they experienced the technologies in action. And one surveyed fleet said that their drivers were still unhappy with some aspects of the clean vehicle policies. The main reason for initial pushback from the drivers included usually concerns about the cost of the vehicle conversions and doubts regarding the ability of the clean vehicles to satisfy the requirements of the service. But these concerns were mostly addressed after drivers had the opportunity to experience these vehicles in action. Two-thirds of the responders experienced at least some difficulties in meeting the requirements of the airport clean vehicle policies, while 3 fleets were able to meet the requirements of the clean vehicle policies with no difficulties. Generally speaking, the main barriers that the ground transportation providers encounter while implementing different types of sustainability practices are directly related to the alternative fuel vehicles, their characteristics and limitations, as well as the access to fuel. These are the main barriers that were indicated by the surveyed fleets, and they included the high upfront costs, the range and fueling time of alternative fuel vehicles, access to fuel and infrastructure, lack of qualified certified mechanics, lower prices of gas, and so forth. Some of these barriers can be at least partially mitigated by some strategies that the fleets can take. For example, the use of biofuel vehicles instead of dedicated alternative fuel vehicles can partially mitigate the access to fuel barrier. Or, for example, developing or hiring in-house mechanics instead of relying on outside help can also help with the lack of qualified or certified mechanics in the area. Surveyed fleets reported essentially 3 types of incentives that are currently available to private operators for implementing sustainability projects. First was the federal estate tax credit for purchasing AFVs. Well, this is mainly referring to the federal tax credit up to $7,500 for purchasing the plug-in electric vehicles. Then fleets also mentioned some grants and rebates that existed at the state level, and also the lower airport trip fees that were offered by some of the airports to incentivize the fleets. Additionally, 3 surveyed operators, which is a quarter of our sample, stated that there are currently no incentives for private fleets. And 2 other private fleets were not aware of any existing government incentives for alternative fuel vehicle conversions. Surveyed fleets view the following 4 types of the incentives as the most effective in helping them convert to alternative fuels. It's preferential treatment of the alternative fuels by the airport, then tax credits and rebates, longer airport agreements, possibly with exclusive airport access for running alternative fuel technologies, and direct grants to purchase or convert alternative fuel vehicles, whether at the state or local level. During the interviews, fleets provided the recommendations for designing effective clean vehicle policies. The suggestions range from some vague recommendations to very specific proposals. And the most often cited suggestions are presented on this slide. They included the ensure that the fleet have access to fueling, so that the airports would have a fueling infrastructure either at the airport or somewhere in close proximity to the airport. Then also involve ground transportation providers in developing the clean vehicle policies. Treating all operators equally was also a big issue for many fleets. They felt that sometimes they were not treated equally by the policies that were imposed by the airports. And then some fleets requested or stated that they would really appreciate longer or exclusive contracts with the airports whenever they run the alternative fuel vehicles, because that would give them an opportunity to recoup some of that additional investment. And also ensuring consistency between policy and local regulations would also help with encouraging the fleets to convert to alternative fuels. as well as stimulating the alternative fuel vehicle usage as opposed to restricting the use of regular vehicles. Most operators that we surveyed for this study indicated that they were directly or indirectly affected by the TNC operations at the airports. Traditional ground transportation providers such as taxi cabs reported suffering significant loss in market share to TNCs, but even the some of the providers that were that initially did not even expect to be influenced by TNCs, such as rental companies or parking shuttles, they also noticed that the entrance of TNC in the airport market also affected their business as well. The common suggestions that were provided by the surveyed operators to the airport regarding the treatment of TNCs included that the fleet suggested that the airport should treat all operators equally, so make everybody basically pay the same fees and provide the same access to the airport facilities. And then the airport, they also stated that the airport policy towards the TNCs is not helping the traditional operators. As mentioned before, a lot of fleets feel that TNCs often enjoy the advantageous positions, that they sort of fly under the radar. And a lot of fleets, not only taxi cabs, but other ground transportation fleets as well, say that the airports should not impose any more regulations on taxi cab industry, which is already struggling with the due to the competition with the TNCs. Finally, I would like to mention the limitations of the study. Again, Austin mentioned that at the beginning, but I also want to conclude with that as well. The analysis is based on mainly on the information that we obtained from the interviews of the airports and ground transportation fleets, and it reflects the opinions and interpretations of these fleets and airports. So no attempt was made to independently verify the accuracy of the provided information. While we made an attempt to select the airports of different sizes and from different regions, for this analysis, the majority of the surveyed airports are still large hubs. So the medium hub airports and especially small airports are underrepresented in the sample. Also, the analysis is based on a very small data sample. We only had 24 data points. So due to this low number of observations, the conclusions of the study have no statistical significance, but are rather anecdotal in nature and should be interpreted accordingly. It doesn't mean that the data obtained from such surveys is useless. It does provide a lot of useful information. You just have to keep in mind that you cannot extrapolate the results of this survey on the entire population. And last but not least is that the results presented here are still preliminary and in the form of a draft because the ACRP synthesis report will be published probably in the next month or so. But until it's published, everything that you heard here is still a draft. Thank you for your time, and now we'll be happy to answer your questions.
Okay, so I'm just, thank you. I just wanted to leave up Austin and Alex's contact information for a moment. What I'm going to do is I'll come back to this slide in a second, but I did want to remind everybody how to ask a question using that Q&A box in the bottom lower right-hand corner of your screen. Simply type in your question and or comment. I know Alex and Austin said everything is in draft format, so the PowerPoint is not available for download yet. But as soon as that is available, we will make sure that a PDF copy of the presentation is available off of the Qatar website when the report is published. So Alex and Austin, I'm going to throw out some questions for you, and we'll see how it goes. Okay, so the first question comes in. It says, how will automated technologies come into play with airports and ground transportation operators?
We heard a lot of talk about the automated technologies, and obviously this is the new trend that everybody wants to be in that business. And since the transportation network companies are largely expanding at the airport and as well as other markets, they also have big plans for the automation. So far, what we've seen is that automation is going to happen. The thing is, we don't really know when exactly this will happen. One thing we can tell for sure is that if it's going to happen, it's probably going to happen at the fleet side first, because there are a lot of opportunities to experience a lot of to extract a lot of benefits out of the fleet operations that are centrally managed and centrally fueled and those types of things. Additionally, if you look at the airport operations are very confined and they are very controlled. It's a very controlled environment, so it provides ample opportunities for implementing those automated technologies at the airports. But again, the projections of when and where are just so dramatic that it's really hard to tell what's reliable and what's not. But again, it's going to happen.
Okay. Our next question comes in and says, did any of the airports offer incentives to airport employees for switching to clean fuels, such as a reserved or close parking?
We did hear that, but this had to do with the private vehicles, and the airports did mention that they do have the certain incentives in terms of they provide either free parking or they provide free charging for the electric vehicles at the airports. But the main purpose of this study was to focus on ground transportation operators, on the fleets that provide service at the airport. So while we did hear some responses that were saying that they incentivize not only the fleets but also their employees and the customers of the airport, but the primary focus of this study was the policies that are geared towards the fleets that provide service at the airport.
Okay. Our next question says, how were the requirements communicated with the ground transportation operators? And then the next question of that follow-up question says, how did they compare their airport against peers with regard to automated vehicle adoption?
The requirements typically for those airports that had formal policy, it was written in the agreements with the operators. So it was if the operator wants to operate at the airport, there was an explicit requirement what exactly they need to do. It specified the types of the vehicles, the types of the inspection that they have to go through, and things like that. So it was well formalized. So the operators did know what exactly they needed to do. And as far as the comparing the airports against each other, yes, all the airports that had active policies in place, or even the ones that were just thinking about that, they were all aware of similar policies at other airports. In fact, they referred us to some other airports and said, hey, you really need to talk to that airport because they are ahead of the curve with that. So yeah, the airports, it's such a community that they all know each other. I guess they go to different trade meetings and conferences where they meet each other and obviously discuss these issues. So yes, they did compare the policies between each other. It doesn't mean that the policies were identical, but at least they were aware of what other airports are doing.
Okay. This next question is a sort of a three-part question that says, how much did airports incentivize clean vehicles with lower rates? And what was the dollar or percentage in reduction? And is it substantial enough to cause the switch?
The ones that we've seen, the airports that we surveyed, typically the reduction was rather substantial. Usually it was about 50%. So you would get half the airport fees, the trip fees, if you run alternative fuel vehicles. From the other side as well, that's some airports that imposed not an incentives but a penalty-based system. They would impose a penalty which would be double or triple the trip fee for the operators that run conventional vehicles. So again, both the incentives and the penalties were pretty significant, so so that they would incentivize switching the behavior.
Okay. Next question comes in and says, how might responses to the survey from airports be increased, or what happens if you incentivize them?
Well, well, if we incentivize them, yeah, maybe if we buy them lunch or provide gift cards to Starbucks or something. So yeah, maybe that will increase their participation. But again, you have to keep in mind that this was a synthesis study, so the primary goal was not to cover the entire population. It wasn't the goal. It's not a data-driven study, even though we did need to get the responses. It was not completely reliant on the volume of the data, because in order to get the real volume, first of all, you need a much longer data collection period. We only had a few months to collect the data. I don't know, Austin, can you add? Do you have something to add?
No, I think that about sums it up. Between our limited data collection time and, again, we were looking for more of an in-depth kind of narrative of the experience of these airports and the fleets versus just a quick, 10-question survey. If it had been a different type of survey, we may have gotten more responses. But again, that's, as Alex mentioned, that's not what we were looking for.
Okay. Next question comes in. It says, would there be benefit of a national compliance standard to allow providers in multiple airports to more easily comply?
More easily comply. So the question is there a benefit of having a national standard for the clean vehicle policy?
Yeah, national compliance, a benefit of a national compliance standard to allow providers in multiple airports to more easily comply.
Well, I'm not sure if that's even a possibility with all different airports and their different airport structures.
Yeah, having the same or requiring the same requirements for all airports.
Right. I'm not sure that's even a possibility, because the airports are all different. Some of them are organized as an authority. Some of them are owned by the local municipalities, and the size of the airports matters as well. So from a national standpoint, I guess it would be a benefit if everybody was on the same page, but then we would have to raise the same question about the states and about different states, because different state has their own regulations regarding the alternative fuel vehicles, the different incentives. So would it be a benefit to have this consistent across the United States? I guess, but will it ever happen? I don't know.
And I'd like to add to that too that our airports that did kind of implement these sort of stringent requirements, they told us that this took a lot of time, a lot of resources, and a lot of dedication on behalf of airport staff to kind of make these policies happen and to regulate them. And I think that would just not be feasible at some of the medium and smaller hubs.
Okay. And then one last question says, what do you think the impact of TNCs will have on airport ground transportation operators, and how will the airports manage them?
Well, from what we've seen is that TNCs has had a tremendous impact on the both airport operations and the fleets that operate at the airport. If you listen to the taxi cab industry, they are saying that, well, TNCs are going to take over, so this is it. They pretty much won. But at the same time, if you look at it from a different perspective, well, TNC is a new model and new business model, and so far it's being developed and tested. So we don't know how exactly it's going to turn out. So from what we've seen, none of the TNCs are profitable yet. So even though they've taken some market share from traditional operators, doesn't mean that they will be able to continue over long-term periods. So I mean, I do see a place for traditional operators at the airport. So definitely the TNCs will have their place as well, but it doesn't mean that they're going to eliminate the entire market for other operators there. So far we don't know how things are going to work out for TNCs as well in the long term.
Okay. Well, I will say thank you very much to Alex and Austin today for the great presentation. I have opened up the survey on your end. If you could take a few moments to complete that, as that feedback is very valuable to not only Alex and Austin, but to the entire Qatar Transportation webcast series. We do have a webinar scheduled for next Tuesday, which is off of our normal rotation schedule, and these are two papers that were published in the Journal of Public Transportation. So we've got two papers being presented by two of our authors, so about 20 minutes apiece. One will focus on, does the future of mobility depend on public transportation, presented by Dr. Carrie Watkins. And then we have another presentation, again about 20 minutes, on can public transportation compete with automated and connected cars, and that's presented by Ralph Bueller. So again, thank you so much for joining us today, and we'll see you next Tuesday. Thank you, everyone.